Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you happenstance into this truth bomb riff, my name is Patrick Lovell. I'm the producer with the $71 trillion truth. And I am recording this on Tuesday, July 6th, 2026, at approximately 10 a.m. my time. And I am feeling refreshed. I'm feeling focused. I'm feeling like I've got a lot of clarity in this continuation of my 846th offering. As those of you who know that this is part lecture, part self sermon, part self help therapy, but it's all in service to presenting what's behind me, the clean New Deal, which is the only plan that exists requisite the problem that we're encountering. And I am really seeing this so much. I don't know if I'm seeing it more clearly than ever before, but a lot of things have taken shape over the course of the last few days, maybe the last several weeks, that further what the notion of this whole effort has always been about. So, first and foremost, I had to disappear to the desert. I went to one of the greatest national parks in the United States, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and basically set sail on an adventure with my son where we just scaled massive vertical rocks looking over canyons that were, thousands of feet deep with the most beautiful sunset I think I've ever seen. And then we were camped next to an incredible river that was absolutely crystal clear and so refreshing that, I mean, I think the temperature was about 57 to 60 degrees, depending on the time. And after a really hot day with temperatures over 100 degrees, getting in that was like, out of body experience. And then later at nighttime, we sat next to the river and hung out and looked at the canopy of stars. And there were so many stars that I literally could see the outcropping of the Milky Way. It was just extraordinary. And to kind of put this into perspective, the reason I had to escape was just the nature of everything of this moment with the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the stupidity of people wanting to celebrate, given the fact that our country has become this train wreck of corruption and collusion and tyranny and fascism and these things that are so overwhelming in the midst of knowing that, for example, given what's happening over the course of last year, there were no King's rallies. There was no protest. There was just this deafening silence of people just basically checking out, just like, hey, you know what? I'm going to enjoy the moment for what it is. I'm not going to basically stick out like a sore thumb. I'm not going to draw attention to myself. I'm not going to, create a counterinsurgency to this insanity that we're in the midst of. And, I'm just going to blend in. Maybe I'll post some pretty remarkable, cool memes, this and that, where everybody can kind of feel like keyboard social justice warriors. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I had to just turn off social media completely and just think and just be with my son and just kind of take inventory of what it is that I'm in the midst of. And, in doing so, I don't think I thought hard at all about anything. I just did. And by doing that, which is really cool because I ended up by a really beautiful lake. I already mentioned, but I can't describe to you how beautiful the sunsets were, and in kind of a weird sort of portrait way. If I were to celebrate red, white, and blue, it doesn't get any better than the red rock sandstones and these towering white granite cliffs, both of which are reaching to the blue sky. I mean, it was so phenomenal. It was literally, like, for me, almost indescribable. But it was almost indescribable because, you know, I, in my own mind, have been sort of relishing this notion that this anniversary, on the heels of me being on this journey, really this odyssey, since I made my first film and we released it 13 years ago. And 13 was principally a sort of inspiration that I took from the original 13 colonies in their bid to overthrow, at that time, King George III, and of course, all that goes with it, to become the United States of America, which of course was to break the bondage of tyranny, to envisage liberty based on a thinking man's understanding of how government has to operate, which is, of course, separation of powers, Bill of Rights, Constitution, that no man or seemingly corporation over the course of 250 years is above the law, which we all know is ludicrous given everything that's going on. And so when you think of the arc and everything that you're in the midst of and where you fit in the food chain, and you contrast that to where I've been on my journey, where I made my first film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, which I'll post a link to below, that if you watch it, it feels as if you could have seen it, it could have been made yesterday. It poses the questions of which nobody ever asks, which is the symmetry of power and how it works. As it turned out, it was prologue to my seminal work with my team that was called The Con. And The Con is the revelation of the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that would create the 2008-9 great financial crisis predicated on what we call the housing crisis that would lead to a global calamity that would lead to ultimately why I say I'm the producer with the $71 trillion truth. The first effort that we had were a 5-part docu-series, 6 hours in length, that we got out to the public for many years. We distributed, I think we were downloaded 4 or 5 million times, which was reasonable. And then we had it out there free for a long time, that people were just overwhelmed by so much else happening in the ecosphere to where we didn't have the right advertising or marketing, or more importantly, the types of tech experts that could push this sort of content to the right places to find eyeballs that are looking for this sort of content. What I've learned along the way is that there are forces that be that determine what we see, how we see it, when we see it, and that's gotten worse and worse and worse. And meanwhile, I'm pushing this boulder of truth up the hill, because when we revealed the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, that involved literally tens of millions of felonies, that led to tens of trillions of dollars being released illegally to the cause agents of what created that global calamity. And I was able to get the first part of the series out there, but I wasn't able to put together everything that I had on the shelf for season 2 that had monumental revelations that, for those of you who are young, wouldn't understand what this means, even though it's created the world that you live in. But it also creates clarity, a light bulb into the shadow of darkness of how the system has evolved illegally to create the criminality that we're all drowning in. And what that was the Federal Reserve of the United States has always been designed as the lender of last resort. But there's methodologies and there's regulation and there's rules and there's statutes for which the Federal Reserve is supposed to operate, as is the Congress of the United States, who has the power of the purse. There is a difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. But that all got shrouded behind emergency scenarios because of this giant racketeering enterprise that involved tens of millions of felonies. Felonies mean, depending on the degree of the felony, that if you were found guilty, you would either lose your license, you would be fined out of existence, or you would go to prison if the law was working. But this was so enormous that it overwhelmed the United States' ability in law enforcement because of many things that took place during the run-up to this madness over the course of literally decades that involved what we call deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization, that took the cops off the beat of what keep the regulators in check, meaning the financial system in check through regulation, where we just basically legalized absolute calamity of criminal enterprise, okay? And in the aftermath, when they predictably blew up the world, where thousands of people were telling everybody this was going to happen, when ultimately the former Federal Reserve chairman was famously on record for saying nobody could have seen this coming, when, as it turns out, I have the information that he had it all set out in front of him. I'm referring to Alan Greenspan, who had the power as the chief regulator of the Federal Reserve through a mandate from Congress called the Homeowner Equity Protection Act, to where, given certain information, he was supposed to act to be able to regulate those markets. He did just the opposite, that enabled this insanity, this pipeline of criminality that many of you might regard as you think you understand the system, because they did a very good job showing the first sort of aspects of this. There's 2 major films. One is The Big Short, and the other is Inside Job, that many of you may have seen. But they were basically a drop in the bucket for what it was that I discovered and put together on behalf of the American people. And I put together half of what I had. To put that into perspective, the federal government literally has approximately, for the sort of apparatuses that are supposed to prevent this sort of thing from happening, somewhere in the vicinity of 90,000 employees. More than that, really, but 90,000 specifically in the, I'm conflating certain numbers. Let me back up. They have a $90 billion a year budget and tens of thousands of employees that are dedicated to make sure this doesn't happen. This is what they get paid to do, okay? To prevent these sorts of things from happening. But because we have a saying called the fish rots from the head, to where from President Clinton on and the CEOs of Wall Street got together to create deregulation that created the supermarket of banking of absolute fraud, okay? Fraud, by the way, is deception for profit, which is criminal. Most of it leading to jail terms and fines if they were found guilty. But the reality is the system failed so much from deregulation that even though we give $90 billion a year to tens of thousands of employees to do what is supposed to happen for the United States to function as a nation of character, or I should just say integrity. You have to think of it like a plane flies because the systems operate the way they're designed. A ship floats because the ship, works the way it is designed. And how is it designed? By tens of thousands of employees that have engineering degrees. They know exactly what's going on. They work on different parts of whatever that apparatus is. We have giant verticals that manage it, and they're billion-dollar operations that make sure that these operations work. Same goes for the federal government as it relates to what it is that I'm talking about. But because we've become a nation of absolute corruption and absolute criminality, these diabolical bastards figured out ways to basically take down the protections that built up this system that created a superpower that ultimately was closer to living up to our principles, or at least these edicts, like in order to form a more perfect union, to establish liberty and justice for all of that is predicated on systems of integrity, which of course are predicated on the character of those we allow to get into those positions of power, whether they're assigned by a president that we elect or members of Congress and so on and so forth, or because they're in these institutions and they work through the process and they get elevated because they've got senior longevity and they know what they're doing, they work in the system. That's what completely failed. The institutions failed, and they got so bad during this time period, specifically when President Obama was elected to create an FDR moment. He had a people's mandate. He had such an extraordinary victory, riding the white horse of hope and change we can believe in because of all of those things that were taking place with the great financial crisis, the war in Iraq, the years of Bush, all of the disparities of wealth, inequality, those things that would launch the Occupy Wall Street movement, of which that was my first film, surfing across the United States, understanding what that was all about, in context, understanding the power that we erected that basically overcame this system to create what I would call back in the day increasing creeping tyranny or creeping authoritarianism that would ultimately lead to what we're in the midst of. That created the opportunity for forces that have always been in the system. We've had Jim Crow to the John Birch Society, America First, all sorts of manner, shape, or being of a fusion of Christo-fascist America with the billionaire or millionaire class, throughout most of their history that are now billionaires. I'm talking about Koch brothers. I'm talking about all manner, shape, or form of libertarian billionaires that have been funding these sorts of scenarios for literally 30 years. It doesn't take long for you to go do a little bit of investigation into some of the things that I have mentioned to understand what they are. They're simply white supremacy, okay? And that was always antithetical to the government that we erected that was always having this push and pull and this sort of contradictory scenario, going back to the founding with the Three-Fifths Statute, Thomas Jefferson's proclamation and the Declaration of Independence, and all of these things that made you go, huh, it's like all men are created equal, except we've got a Three-Fifths Statute. A lot of that was overcome during the Martin Luther King era and the era of civil rights that was only made possible after we had a civil war where the abolitionists and Abraham Lincoln defeated the South, to where we reconstituted the Republic, a rebirth of a nation that would ultimately then let Jim Crow escape, that would create all of those things that I levied. And then ultimately we would face, the fascists in World War II, and we overcame that. But underneath it all, there has always been a mechanism in this country of finance, of banking, of, shall we say, industrial capitalism that would lead to earlier eras of industrialization, robber baron type eras that would ultimately upsurge incredible innovations in all manner, shape, or form of manufacturing and production that would develop these certain situations, of which many of you may recall that, for example, for all of his flaws, Henry Ford, created incredible innovations and mechanisms in the assembly line, but he also created a situation where workers got paid enough to afford the product, which would create an ecosystem of the economy. That's what we think of when we think of capitalism, okay, for the most part. So many other things that we could talk about in terms of merchants, this, that, and the other. But, he also had the flaws because he was all in on white supremacy and he very much supported Adolf Hitler. And so there was those contradictions. But ultimately, we've always had this struggle in the United States, lest we forget our own genocide with the North American Indians and the manifest destiny of Europeans and white settlers and this, that, and the other coming to try to explore, creating freedoms that immigrants never had in Europe because of the caste system of aristocracy, but under the banner of liberty and justice and everybody could find their way and opportunity, created this really ambitious and this gangbuster mentality that, with fused with growth, would lead to all sorts of other horrific things, like I just prefaced, American Indian genocide, North American Indian genocide, as well as many other things. Might equals right is what I'm trying to say in those particular situations. All of those pieces of our history are very much the constructs that have created what we are. But at every stage of the game, the United States, the American people, have found a way to live true to what we put down on paper. Oriented more towards that direction. It's been a battle, all right, until 2008-9. Now, this is what happened at that time period. President Obama, like I said, came in writing his, mandate, hope and change we can believe in. Look, we got to believe, we're better than this. We can live up to what we put on paper. I'm an example. I'm, basically African-American, white grandparents, from the World War II greatest generation. I'm a guy that came up in the system, self-made, got my scholarships, go to Harvard, become the editor of the Crumbs, and all of these sorts of things where somebody of that background could, aspire to the highest levels of government in our land. But ultimately what would happen, which I think is one of the greatest unnerving and enormous setbacks in our country's history, is the contradiction of having hope and change we can believe in and all of these aspiring ideologies that were simply platitudes for Obama to come in, tell the American people what they wanted to hear, but be an agent for the system that destroyed the world. He put everybody back in power who created the 2008 great financial crisis. And what they did, instead of holding the bad players to account, which were the CEOs of Wall Street, because they operated like a mafia, like a mafiocracy is what I would describe. So many things that we described in the con, as well as Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, that demonstrates all this situation. But ultimately, by putting all of the people in play that created it, they all knew the nuts and bolts, how things work, and they basically maneuvered the Federal Reserve to provide tens of trillions of dollars of liquidities to save the global financial system that got destroyed by crime. And they paid themselves incredible fees in the process. Everybody on the upside got super rich. And that was the first time in history that it happened. And in the aftermath, Congress created these laws called Dodd-Frank that were supposed to make sure that this would never happen again. But it was complicated language. Nobody ever described what actually happened. Nobody ever described what was exactly in Dodd-Frank. And I can tell you, I had to sort all that out myself in my process to become the producer with the $71 trillion truth. And in so much, what I found was that it's just smoke and mirrors for the powerful to keep the status quo. Why? Because of what we all know. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We all understand Citizens United with dark money into the system creates a revolving door. And I think we can all understand by now that people lie. They talk out of both sides of their mouth. Most politicians, where character and honesty and integrity have nothing to do with winning elections. Being able to have a lot of money behind you, being able to penetrate certain markets, tell people what they want to hear, while at the same time telling those that are paying for the campaigns and how they got vetted through this whole situation what they want to hear, where it's inside outside voice, like Hillary Clinton would say. That then we elevate people that aren't working for a country of, by, and for the people. We're elevating those working of, by, and for the corruption. Now, as I'm recording this on July 6th, a day after, as it turns out, two things that had a lot of our attention going after the aftermath. And I saw, by the way, many videos of carnage in Newport Beach and strange things that were taking place all over the country, typical chaos, I suppose, which was weird as hell, in addition to celebrations, this, that, and the other. But of course, World Cup soccer and Donald Trump putting his thumb on the scales by the decision that, of course, everything Donald Trump touches turns to what. And I think that had some sort of, distracting quality for Team USA. Maybe they were outplayed by a much better team and they would have lost one way or the other. But I don't think it worked well for their confidence when the whole world was like, they're cheaters. The whole world looked at the United States as if, my God, and it was just expressed so easily through what we call the beautiful game, of course, because the World Cup's the most popular, sporting event in the world. And I've been caught up in it, by the way, all summer. I've just loved to see all of the fans. I loved watching the Scottish fans, the Norwegian fans. And of course, that wonderful player from Norway has really won me over in social media. But Team USA unfortunately got beat yesterday. That was a big part of it. But of course, the next thing is Graham Plattner. Now, Graham Plattner is, of course, on top of mind for a lot of people, because what it reveals is here it was a supposed progressive candidate that was out of the military, that spoke a lot of the right language for progressives, that would go so far as to get the endorsement big time of Bernie Sanders, as he was calling out the billionaire ownership of this country. And he had maybe surface level plans, along with Bernie Sanders, who I always call out has surface level plans in context to what it is that I'm revealing and what I'm all about. But ultimately, he would say things like, look, we've got to have a billionaire tax. We've got to turn the tables. He was talking about private equity, the wealth inequality, and all of these things that working class wanted to listen to. Now, this after all of the momentum of Zoran Mondani. And of course, just to kind of check off the boxes of what Zoran, a young guy who comes out of city council in New York, he's charismatic. He's got two really interesting parents, but he runs on the social democracy platform. But to do what exactly? Literally to provide, free transportation for the working class, to provide rent control, to provide childcare, in co-ops with grocery stores, all of which would help with the affordability crisis and are wildly popular in New York's working class, which are many millions of times bigger than the top 0.1% of New York that has all the money, which is really the heartbeat of the billionaire oligarchic global class, which operates out of our financial system, all of which I'm telling you were given tens of trillions of dollars illegally after setting up the world and the largest racketeering grift that I've laid out from Forward 13 through the con, through all of my truth bombs, and I've got 686 of them now, spanning 4 years, to lay out the details which lead to the solution, because I identify the problem that nobody will talk about, because nobody understands it, and those who do are benefiting from it, and those who have the capacity to do it won't, because nobody else is. And I'll explain what that all means in just a moment. But back to Graham Plattner. There is not a cohesive, progressive movement right now other than to suggest getting rid of Citizens United, creating a unification of the working class based on the affordability crisis that may or may not lead to a billionaire tax, which is really a Band-Aid when you look at it through the prism of Bernie Sanders and what was Graham Plattner's platform. But now it's revealed, and it seemed like Graham Plattner, from the tattoo to, some problems with some potential harassment, to now we find out that he literally, from what I understand, raped his ex-girlfriend. And I think the circumstances are pretty clear. She didn't want him in one night. I think he was in a drunken rage. He breaks in. I believe he rapes her. I might be, dramatizing it a little bit, but at the same time, I think that's primarily what happened. She sat on the information, or she tried to tell certain people, they didn't listen. And now it became politically expedient for some people to get that information out there. They did. Graham Plattner looks like he's going to have to pull out. He's losing funding. He's losing a lot of credibility. He says that he didn't do it. It's one of those he said, she said situations. It looks like the patterns are that, it's probably likely he did do it, given everything that I'm seeing. I don't have the evidence. I don't know exactly what's going on. All I know is that in the background of all of this, there was due diligence by people that didn't look at this or think it was worthy to bring forward, and shows that his platitudes, which I've just mentioned, were going to offset whatever skeletons he had in the closet. Now it appears that's not the case. And where is that going to lead us to? So you've got to understand what the playing field is right now, okay? We have literally, and have you done the work on this? Do you know how many races are up for grabs in the midterms? It turns out there's 33 seats up for grabs in the Senate, of which I believe there's 13 Democrats that have pretty much controlled, Republicans pretty much control 20 in terms of basically the way the numbers work. And that leaves, I guess, so if I did the math correctly, what did I say? That's 33. And then there's, that is 30 seats. So that's all of them. Okay. So that's kind of the race right now. So the Democrats have to win a net of 4 seats in the House, in the Senate. And because there's 2 independents. And basically, if you look at all of the Senate Democrats running, most of them are traditional status quo DNC affiliated Democrats. A lot of these are incumbents. Think of Cory Booker, think of Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff is getting a lot of attention because he is really speaking clearly and eloquently with a lot of power and clarity as it relates to Donald Trump. And so is Senator Warnock. It's amazing how Georgia is such a central player to this whole midterm situation. But of course, the mainstream media is also looking at, Graham Plattner because it was such a pivotal seat because of Maine, because of Susan Collins. But also Texas is a huge situation because of all things, how huge it is, how horrible Ken Paxton is, because he's right up there with Donald Trump being as buffoonish criminal as it gets. But at the same time, that's what the voters of Texas have been able to endure and actually enjoy, by way of going back to my earlier point between John Birch Society, America First, any neo-Nazi groups, white supremacy, mega churches. That confluence, the way that my mentor, I love her to death, June Carbone on the new Untouchables is laid out, is literally the synergy between this perversity of billionaires buying congressional seats in addition to influence with mega churches. And the construction is literally deregulation and tax incentives, tax exempt status. Think about that. Money, control, power, perversion. That's what these clowns have been able to basically erect to control both sides of the House and ultimately the White House. And of course, the Supreme Court, led by the billionaire technocracy that has been destroying this country for now decades, made possible again by my premier point. Because none of these guys would have had the power and the money and the standing that they have if not for 2 major elements. Citizens United being able to funnel dark money into the system where nobody knows where the money is coming from, to be able to get candidates to do everything that they say that they need them to do by buying their elections practically, off the heels of having tens of trillions of dollars going to the billionaire class through the financial system that got that money illegally through the smoke and mirrors, where Congress should have been the power of the purse to basically create a sort of safety net for the United States. And in that composite sort of power, Congress and the Department of Justice during the time of Obama, they had the responsibility requisite. Remember, I told you they have over 90,000, or excuse me, tens of thousands of employees. The Justice Department has 120,000 employees. Before Trump, I think 20,000 have quit since. So 100,000 just in the Department of Justice alone, but $90 billion a year to be able to make sure this doesn't happen. But instead, they all worked for the billionaire class. They all worked for destroying tens of millions of people illegally, setting up on a rat trap of basically a free house, and all of these too good to be true situations that were predicated on a pipeline of fraud. Think Henry Ford, but in the housing industry, the assembly line, where everybody was incentivized to lie, steal, and cheat, and then were rewarded with tens of trillions of dollars. Why do you think we call it the Epstein class? What was the Epstein class doing concurrent? Literally raping children. Now, let's put that into perspective briefly with Graham Plattner. Not to compare apples to oranges, but Graham Plattner is being held just like, trying to think of the comedian turned Senator Al Franken in Minnesota, where he, I think, sexually harassed a woman. In this case, Graham Plattner probably, he said, she said, physically raped his girlfriend at the time. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it, it's still rape. But just, these are the facts, right? So he's held to a standard where he's got to back out of the situation when he's focused supposedly. And when I say focus, I'm saying surface level of the billionaire class. Graham Plattner never understood the information that I'm revealing to you, not even remotely, okay? I mean, this guy would be in sixth grade comparing to the PhD level stuff that I'm revealing to you in the easiest way I can, right? But Graham Plattner might have had some good instincts, and he came across as a ho-hum military guy, and his whole, shtick about no one, not blindly, funding the Pentagon with all of the fraud that happens at the Pentagon, given these endless wars for oil. A lot of us would be like, yeah, that's got to end. And we're on it. And then he gets tripped up by the stuff in comparison to, let's think about this. E. Jean Carroll literally raped, right? I mean, that's what the court found in the conviction of Trump, the civil conviction that led to, now she won a $5 million judgment finally, after I think $83 million is what he owes her, but he's got to pay up $5 million now. And people are calling that a victory when Trump made $2 billion in the first year of his second term by lying, stealing, and cheating, looting, and breaking the law, the Constitution, that everybody's like, okay, we're not going to talk about that. Let's really talk about Graham Plattner's sexual deviancy and stuff. And I'm saying this because Graham Plattner should go. He should never have been able to get to the level he was. But according to a lot of people in the circumference of this, those that were looking into his background chose to ignore certain things because they thought he was the right guy at the right time. So they put their backing, and this would lead to somebody like Bernie Sanders getting behind him. And they didn't do the due diligence. That's how pathetic the Democratic Party is. In this particular case, that's the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now it's blown up in their face. But let's remind ourselves the difference between Democratic voters and Republican voters. The Republican voters don't give a shit. You've got Donald Trump that has been allegedly described as raping children, covered up by the FBI during Obama's administration, by the way, with those 302s. And I think actually it probably goes back to Clinton's administration now that I think about it. And let's at least we forget all the things that Clinton was involved with, Lewinsky Gate, and then weirdly, honestly, Kenneth Starr being the prosecutor against him, ultimately to become a defense attorney for none other than Jeffrey Epstein, given everything that we're learning about Epstein in the billionaire Epstein class, right? So 1,200 victims of the Epstein files, of which we had the Transparency Act led by Ro Khanna and Massey, that the Trump administration is not, it's the law of Congress and they're not releasing the other 3 million files, let alone Todd Blanche covering it all up. And Todd Blanche he's now going to be, I think, confirmed. I mean, they're going through the process of this defense attorney for Don the Con Rico pedo pig, who's been a criminal for decades. And what do we know about Donald Trump? We know that Donald Trump literally was involved when he got into real estate after he inherited $400 million from Fred Trump, to his own special sauce of racism, and they all came from a background of criminals to begin with. The grandfather Trump was literally a pimp in the Yukon. The entire family has been 3 generations of liars, and that's their business model. And Donald Trump inherits $400 million. He gets involved with the mob back in the 70s, late 70s, 80s. He does this huge development stuff, with literally the 5 families of New York. Rudolph Giuliani at that time is on the opposite side of the fence. One thing leads to another. Donald Trump is also involved with the Russians, and as it turns out, the Rothschild family bailed him out. He had 6 different bankruptcies, and he kept getting bailed out by these super high-end people. And every time they bailed this guy out, there must have been another trick of the trade. At least we forget that Donald Trump was also in Atlantic City with his casinos, in addition to his stupid freaking, Trump steaks, Trump wine, Trump University, Trump, airlines. All of these companies failed while he was laundering money for the mob and laundering money for, quite frankly, international mob, most notably the Russians, as well as, of course, all things Middle Eastern countries, into his real estate in Manhattan, as well as other, properties in Chicago, wherever they are, and everything else that constitutes. This is what he was doing for decades. And he, with that background, got hired as America's favorite "you're fired" to normalize this guy, I think 16 seasons on NBC, whose president at the time was Jeff Zucker, who went back and forth between NBC and CNN. And Les Moonves had famously quipped, Trump was good for ratings. The power behind the scenes and these mob bosses and everybody else normalized Trump in America as this personality. He was always playing the media, and he was always saying these things through National Enquirer. And then later, when he would, basically attack the New York Times and everybody else's fake media, because he knew from inside he could manipulate media, while he was doing deals with Khashoggi to buy his yacht when they lived in the same tower, I think in, the east end. Sorry, what part of Manhattan, doesn't matter. But all of these major players, from literally Robert Maxwell, who was Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and then, of course, Adnan Khashoggi, who turns out to be the world's largest arms dealer, and many others that were affiliated with all sorts of insane things that were happening in the 80s and the 90s. Donald Trump was in that sort of matrix, and he was being bailed out by these guys the whole time, to which he ends up, after all of these bankruptcies, literally as this established guy of a success when he was failing left and right. And NBC made him, normalize, and they were playing roulette with our democracy, to the point in 2016, it was clear now in the aftermath, even though the MAGAs are like Russia, 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 Russia was completely involved with sabotaging the 2016 election. There's no question about it. With their KGB, online sort of division called I think it was called the IRS, led by then this guy Prigozhin, who ends up getting murdered, he got plane crashed, of course, because he went rogue under Putin, 2 years ago, because of the war in Ukraine, where he turned the troops around, tried to go back to Moscow. Shortly thereafter, he gets plane crashed. There's a lot that's been going on. But what I'm trying to tell you is that Donald Trump was part of an international racket for eons. And then they get into a position where they basically, because they had been doing, let's just call it focus group work, with all these billionaires, from the Koch brothers to Americans for Prosperity to the Mercers and Cambridge Analytica, and all of these different apparatuses that knew all they had to do for the numbers and specific swing states and everything else is that they had to activate the mega churches, and they had to activate, really on the fringes, some sort of masculinity type of scenario with the Latinos, with the African Americans, with, of course, what we call incel younger kids that, had to go through COVID and the whole deal, to where, hey, let's give them bread and circuses. Well, for example, what we just saw at the White House with all things UFC with Dana White as well as Nitro Circus, right? I mean, this is bread and circuses in addition to the reflecting poll and all of the other insanity that's been going on. But at the same time, these are all tricks of the trade that billionaires, through professional technocrats like myself, by the way, and I've said this in a lot of my truth bombs for you just seeing this for the first time, I come from a background where I studied political science and journalism in college, but I've been in the business of entertainment and making movies and film and television and this and that for a very long time. And I'm an entrepreneur, which means I'm a capitalist. I'm not a late stage capitalist. I'm not a monopoly capitalist. I'm not in a in a mafiocracy, and I'm not a liar. I'm just a guy who competes for business. That makes me an entrepreneur. So definitionally, yeah, capital is what makes these things flow. So I just wanted to point that out. If you understand, a little bit more about me, my ideology is social democrat. I'm a progressive. I believe in a hybrid system. Yeah, I believe in a safety net for a lot of people. At the same time, I know that you've got to have free market and a lot of other things. But I understand how the system is supposed to work. And I know that you have to have rules and regulations of professionals that make this stuff work so that you can have incredible, I don't know, like 747s and, giant ships and nuclear powered submarines and like incredible cars and this, that, and the other. And there's nothing that we can't really accomplish because we have so much brain power in this country, but it's where we funnel the money and for what system. And since this criminal Don the Con Rico pedo pig, after his first administration and everybody testing the waters, to whatever happened during Biden, and of course during the Biden administration, they did not come down heavy on the Epstein class. Vice President Harris, in her late stage run, was trying to do hope and change we can believe in and make us think that this was like getting out of a bad relationship and that we were going to create joy for everyone without focusing as a prosecutor on the corruption that has metastasized in the body politic to overwhelm the system. And here we are in 2026, bringing it full circle to Graham Plattner and the mistake of the progressive, to try to get this out there. First and foremost, once again, Plattner was not a threat to the system that I'm revealing to you. Neither is James Tallarico. If you look at the, I think it's, by the way, how many offices are available or up for grabs in the House of Representatives? All 435 districts. But if you look at the big numbers across the board, there's literally only 30 progressives after the primaries still in the races in a position to potentially get into Congress to change things. Now, I set all of this up from the standpoint of the clarity that we're looking at right now moving forward is that the Democrats and the progressives do not have a plan requisite Project 2025. They're not speaking truth to power. This is exactly what I was thinking was going to happen. It always happens every election where everybody's talking about all of these different issues, and then something comes up like a sexual harassment or rape or some fucking weird ass thing that destroys Democratic candidates because there's a standard for Democrats, but of course not the Republicans. Again, to remind you, like I need to, 1,200 victims of Epstein still after 4 administrations lurching because of what happened with Pan Bondi and now Todd Blanche, and we're going to probably see continually, more, Trump pardons, Ghislaine Maxwell and everything else. But guys, look at the lay of the land here and what's at stake. We all know AI is happening, right? And let's put this into perspective as well. Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who recently became the world's first trillionaire, became so on a pump and dump, guaranteed all sorts of froth using deceptive acts and practices in the IPO for SpaceX, made possible by government largesse, which is basically social welfare for a billionaire queen who's taken over literally NASA, which was once exploration, to put up, satellites to be able to administer the nature of weather and everything else. To do what exactly? So to spy on us, to create this sort of infrastructure between these AI data centers to be able to fully flood space with further satellites to be able to get more inside and control the future of whatever these billionaire technocrat or billionaire bros that we call them are setting up, through this AI data center situation, they're going to have devastating impacts on the environment as well as the economy. To do what exactly? To basically, create, I don't know, all sorts of things that could lead people to ICE facilities or the gulags. It's just an authoritarian state for billionaires. This is so crystal clear what is going on. This Orwellian threat to American civilization is happening at such Mach speed. It's ludicrous speed, as of course the great Mel Brooks said in Spaceballs, that is overwhelmed anybody's ability to fully create clarity and understand what has to happen to be able to turn the tables on this nightmare, dystopia, authoritarian, fascist, racist scenario that is perverting all things in order to form a more perfect union, first and foremost. And that was the question I kept asking myself with the notion of what is patriotism from the very beginning of when I started my film Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, to where I had to bail out of town to go down to the southern Red Rocks to be able to see the sky for what it is and the stars for what it is. And, you need to believe me when I tell you that nobody has a plan requisite this insanity. And there's only one way to defeat the situation that we're in the midst of: the acknowledgement, the understanding of what it is that I am revealing to you, so that we can create the clean New Deal, which I'll show you the precepts of what they are, and I'll walk you through it in just a second. So thank you for continuing to hold on here. But I now know from experience running up to the primaries what happens, and it's predictable. So I had met a couple of progressive candidates who I introduced the Clean New Deal to, and they wholeheartedly supported the Clean New Deal in our discussions and how it fit into with their campaigns, because most of these progressive candidates are running on, Medicare for all, a better functioning middle class, things like Zoran Mondani to a degree, or Bernie Sanders. And the nature is, from where I'm looking, completely a Band-Aid. Okay, again, to remind you, and I should probably put this into more vivid detail, the GDP of the United States is now $29 trillion. I think we're first or second, depending on the day, with China as the world's largest gross domestic product. That's for 330 million people. When I revealed to you that we provided at least $71 trillion illegally, I think that's to somewhere in the vicinity of less than 500,000 people, maybe 300,000 people. And the top 0.1% of that, i.e. the Jeff Bezos of the world, the Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, I don't know why I'm blanking on what's his name's name, the CEO of Palantir. Anyway, the billionaire class, they made out with the lion's share of this to double down and do things through Citizens United to buy this revolving door of Congress. And then the DNC, on the other hand, has its own set of rules and regulations, rules by way of who's going to play ball for the handpicked people who are going to run for the Democratic Party, of which we also saw play out in this Graham Plattner situation. And it's getting worse by the day, right? And Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, while they might have some plans for private equity, while they do have plans for a billionaire tax raise, it's still on the margins. It's not a comprehensive, crystal clear revelation of a system of criminology. There is no plan to impeach Trump and jail Trump, or to hold the Supreme Court accountable for what it is clearly illegal behavior based on justices of the Roberts Court that are not Supreme Court justices. They're lobbyists for all of manner, shape, or form of big money influence, ranging from dirty fuels to those that wanted to, turn the tables on Roe v. Wade and Goddess Dobbs. So there was this convergence of this religious authoritarianism in the billionaire class. Again, that's the way this always works. The wolves need the sheeple to be able to lie, steal, and cheat, and deprave and rape at will, and they do so willingly. I never forget, and I've used this in many of my truth bombs before, when LBJ said, if you can convince the lowest rung white man that he's higher on the ladder than the highest rung black guy, you can pick his pockets all day. That's an incredibly clever but deviant strategy that keeps this sort of scenario in power. It has nothing to do with democracy, although we know that, for history's sake, LBJ had, obviously the bread and butter and in all things Voter Registration Act and things that were civil rights oriented during Martin Luther King's era. Because we had Martin Luther King, for example, and then we also had chaos at that era as well. But where we are in the game is literally game over. I mean, it was game over when Trump and Elon figured out whatever they did. I'm absolutely certain to steal the election that, what evidence do I have? I've talked to the Election Truth Alliance. I've talked to other people. I've learned much more about elections. I know what happened with Greg Palast's research that revealed 3.5 million voter records were purged because of ancient Jim Crow laws, because these guys are deviant and they play for keeps. They don't let up. They don't relent. They have billionaires pay for verticals to do all of these volatile games. And those of us who aren't MAGA, on one side of the equation, you've got guys like Mark Elias doing heroic work on anti-gerrymandering and all of these other maneuverings to try to prevent, what just took place in the Supreme Court with Calais. And then, of course, all of the things that are happening with mail-in vote, situations. But as all of that was going on in the Supreme Court, by the way, in addition to anti-trans, laws that would enable trans to compete, in cross-gender sports and all of that kind of stuff, the most important decision that the Trump administration, SCOTUS on behalf of the Trump administration or the billionaire, authoritarians, basically has now enabled, on top of everything else, with Trump being above the law because the Supreme Court ignoring 14th Amendment Section 3, that so did the Biden administration when they had the power in their hands with Merrick Garland, who completely screwed the pooch. They didn't see in a Neville Chamberlain-like way what was coming. They just basically sat on their hands and hoped everything would be normalized if they had the power, when in fact they empowered this corruption because they themselves are getting paid by this as well. And I could go more into that, but I want to finish this decision about the Supreme Court decision based on the president and the executive authority of the unitary executive can fire regulators at will. They already got rid of the inspector generals. They already took over the Department of Justice and the FBI. Now the final nail in the coffin. And why is that important? As you listen to me, I'm an investigator. That's what I do. I'm the guy who gets the information from the regulators and the whistleblowers who know how things work. I put the story together as a journalist, a muckraking journalist, to reveal how this works so that hopefully an informed populace would act in their best interests. That's the way it used to work in the United States, but it doesn't work that way anymore. Why? Because we're a nation of fucking idiots. We're a nation of people that are overwhelmed, that don't understand the system. They don't understand what's going on. And I want to ask you where you fit in the food chain. How much money do you make? How many dependents do you have? Where are you? Who are you? What is your education? What do you know? What don't you know? Most of us can look around and see that the system's not working for us. Why do we know that? Well, unless you're top of the point, well, let's just call it 1%. 1%. Let's just say you're worth north of $13 million. You don't have a lot to worry about at the moment, okay? Even though there is stock volatility, and I think we're going to see a major collapse at some point, but they keep staving it off. Computer algorithms, all of these things, very strange. But it looks like the bubble in AI is going to maybe eclipse what happened in 2008. I'm not exactly sure yet. Private banking, private credit, I should say, as well as shadow banking. All of those things are operating the same way. I brought up Dodd-Frank earlier. Dodd-Frank was supposed to prevent this. It's not. It's these guys are, well on their way to doing whatever they want. But see, what happens is, and this goes back to the $71 trillion truth. The reason these guys that are billionaires can operate this way because of tax code, buying the politicians who write the legislation to be above the law, be it the Epstein class, that Trump is showing all of this stuff is crystal clear. So you can't debate me on any of that. And ultimately, the only thing you might be scratching your head about was, okay, well, what about the $71 trillion truth? Look, it's on my website, and I'll walk you through it in just a minute here. But you got to understand, people, that if you give a crack addict unlimited crack and a key to a safe with unlimited crack, really bad things are going to happen. That's what's going on here. And it has been. It's simply, we've got to cut off the money to this billionaire apparatus that has completely gained complete control, which means they're further entrenched. And what are the issues for the Democrats? Well, if you're a social progressive or a social democrat, a lot of people are talking about genocide in Gaza, which is a big deal, and funding Israel, for folks of that where they put that at the top of their priorities, in addition to the affordability crisis and social democracy and this and that. But I honestly don't see a national referendum on this at the moment. And what I can tell you about what happened in Gaza is it is a petri dish of what is to come in the United States based on what we're seeing with all the same players with the AI development and all things ICE. You'd have to be crazy not to understand the parallels that Netanyahu and I believe the IDF was like, look, we're going to demonstrate what we can do with this technology, and we're going to do that, an effort of the Greater Israel Project. I know how everybody frames it with Zionism, and imperialism and all of these types of things, which I don't want to litigate at the moment. But at the same time, it's like that is central to a lot of people. But how does that really, why would all of that happen? Well, the Saudis are authoritarian. The Saudis are the swing producer. Oil is the central commodity that backstops the American dollar and the hegemony of the sovereign wealth currency that gives us this privileged position to where we can basically finance our way out of anything, especially with the liquidity of the Federal Reserve through the smoke and mirrors scenario, of which I'm revealing to you that to this day is illegal in the statutes. It says in Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which gives the United States the exigent lending power of the lender of last resort, that you cannot use the full faith and credit of the United States to backstop commodities trades, specifically in real estate. And especially if there's, racketeering involved. And that's exactly what the 2008 great financial crisis was, that overwhelmed the system, that was never held to account. And so again, when you give a crack addict endless amounts of crack, what's going to happen? The Epstein class in a P. Diddy freak off, which is gang rape of the system. Did that hurt your Constitution? Because we've got 30 progressives running on issues like the affordability crisis and Medicare for all and all of these types of things that can never come to reality unless the entirety of Congress, who isn't working for this machine, understands and says with clarity, we gave this system $71 trillion illegally. If you can't start with that and you can't verbalize that, you cannot speak truth to power and truth to this monstrosity of lies that we're swimming in, which is effectively Armageddon. It literally is Armageddon for democracy, I can assure you that. And if you can't see the forest for the trees, that literally these guys don't care about human life, that if they can practice what happened in Gaza, if they can do that with endless wars, can they do that in the United States? Every time I see this picture of Mohammed bin Salman and Putin laughing together and giving each other a high five, that's what I think they're thinking, to be quite frank with you. Who am I leaving out of the equation? China? We could talk about China and Taiwan and state-run capitalism and what their issues may be, but that's not as on this list of what we're dealing with. As important is the United States, the people of the United States. We, the people, have to rally around the clean New Deal. Otherwise, it's too late. Why? Because now that I've demonstrated the situation, can you only then understand the remedy, which is the clean New Deal? So if SCOTUS is absolutely corrupt, if the unitary executive is completely corrupt, if Congress is completely corrupt, after all of the mega mergers and acquisitions of media, where we see the likes of one of the world's richest men, of course, the chairman of the board of Oracle, whose name eludes me at the moment, Ellison, sorry, Larry Ellison and his son, David Ellison, this mega merger that got Time Warner and Paramount and everything else, and then buy media and propaganda. Okay, that's all Orwellian as well, right? That's controlling the message. And then on top of it, you've got all things, algorithms and how people, can be seen and heard and everything else. And there's only one way to break through this, and that's if tens of millions of people are learning what the truth is. So that means you've got to like, subscribe, and share. I'm not asking you for any money. We do have amazing product on our website that is the antithesis of all things lie, because this is a revolution of truth. And if you buy that, then we could potentially help candidates running for office. But when you look for the lay of the land, and that's what I was trying to do, and this is what I got to finish this thought about the progressive candidates that were championing the Clean New Deal to a point. They got to the point where it was getting closer to the election, and they went with what they thought was going to win, right? Hey, I got to keep talking about Medicare for all. Oh, I got to talk about what's happening in the marketplace of ideas. Trump is doing this, that, and the other. These candidates support that guy. It's always the same thing in this confluence, right? Everybody changes their game plan. It's almost like a fight. You can have a plan until you get smacked in the face, and then you got to deal with what you're dealing with. And so they weren't comfortable enough to be able to walk through the Clean New Deal in a way that says as declaratively as I do. And by the way, you can see that below. It says a declaration to reboot the American dream. That's what this is in context, of course, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution against tyranny, of which we're right back where we started from. And that's been the destiny of my journey, to unplug that, to unpervert the pretzel of this whole thing, to make all of those crooked places straight with clarity in a revolution of truth. So I'm going to share my screen and show you just what the Clean New Deal is all about. And thank you for tuning in, or I should say, thank you for sticking around this long. But I apologize. I got to get this out. I really do feel strong and supportive of this whole thing, because I can see the playing field for what it is. Let me remind you. We've got 33 races up for re-election in the Senate. We've got all 435 seats in districts in the House up for re-election. We've got 30 progressives running, and those progressives are going to run, I'm absolutely certain, on ending military assistance to Israel, which I don't think is going to win. And, basically progressive ideals like, ending Citizens United, a wealth tax on billionaires, and raising funds for Medicare for all rather at this stage, and not even mentioning, quite frankly, all things with the environment, okay? Which, for those of you who know, we have an EPA director by the name of Lee Zeldin, who came out of the oil and gas industry, who destroyed all things, every progressive environmental regulation for the last 40 years, starting with the Clean Air Act and Water Act, and then all things what they call the endangerment policy, which was global warming recognized by the government to influence and build renewable energy infrastructure, which was moving forward, but simultaneously, as of course the Biden administration was speaking out of both sides of its mouth. Yeah, we're spending tons of money on renewable energy research, which was good, but we're going to drill, baby, drill. There wasn't a contiguous sort of branding. So it created this sort of duplicity, which you kind of have to do in a transition. But at the same time, you need to explain that, is what I would say. But ultimately, what I lay out here, okay, is that we don't live in a democracy. We don't function in a capitalistic system. Why? Because democracy would be one person, one vote. Obviously, we've seen with the Voter Registration Act and all things, Calais gutted that, especially for African Americans. And I will just say, as a sidebar, every African-American athlete participating in the Southeast Conference should basically weigh out not playing in the in football this fall as a protest, but they're not going to do that. Okay, just yet another example. Everybody's got to get theirs. Okay, because why? Because everybody lives in the four walls of their existence. And if you get to be a player that can compete at that level to go to the NFL with all of the pressures on you, you're probably like, I don't give a shit about whether or not I vote, to be honest with you. I'll make tons of money and I'll be able to do whatever I want anyway. And they're not exactly wrong. It's everybody else that has to pay the price. Just a point. But we don't live in a capitalistic system. Again, for all of you boneheads who think, America's about free enterprise and this, that, and the other, this is central planning up the wazoo. This is destruction by an authoritarian Politburo that's on par with somewhere between state-run capitalism, like what's happening with Xi Jinping, in China, and then of course all things really Stalin. If you want to know the truth, that's how it works to benefit the oligarchs, and that's exactly all things Putin. We are not a capitalistic system when you allow the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world to blow up and no prosecutions, and we give the criminals tens of trillions of dollars. If you don't walk away from this dialogue with that information central to everything that we do henceforth, you can't do anything. You can't fix any problem without understanding how it works. So we're not a democracy. We don't function as capitalistic system. We don't have free markets. The separation of powers is a joke. Corruption rules everything. Millions are beginning to understand Project 2025, and the Clean New Deal is democracy's answer. People, we just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution by basically further entrenching what is exactly what was laid out in the Declaration of Independence. You could look at the, basically the list of, how do we phrase it, with Thomas Jefferson especially, of what are, God, there's a specific term that's just right at the tip of my tongue, that, were our complaints really against England and why we were rebelling, that just laid out, why we were going to create a revolution. It's the exact same thing with Donald Trump right now, but even worse because of all of the things the fascist Politburo gulag empire that's building this AI data center that's going to, basically the nail in the coffin of everything. That's what's at stake. The end of the environment, the end of democracy, the end of the law. It's all over unless you understand how it all works and how we can fix it. So how are we going to fix it? Okay. So let's take a look at our different precepts, and you got to understand that everything is a perversion of power. Okay. So we get there by understanding the four questions. If we're a nation of the people, for the people, by the people, where the law is equal, would we have a qualified immunity deal where the cops can shoot to kill without being held accountable? It's a rhetorical question. And I say all the time that I don't mind the cops being able to shoot to kill the bad guys. They didn't do that on January 6th, not to a massive degree by any means. They should have. It was an insurrection. Instead, they go shoot people in the back and people who are vulnerable and that aren't in on it and this, that, and the other, working for the billionaire class. They shoot the most vulnerable that don't have a way to fight back, and then they can't be held accountable. That's called tyranny, okay? Now, what about the justices being above the law? Have you seen anything more absurd than this Roberts Court with Alito and Clarence Thomas and, of course, Kavanaugh and the Amy Coney to a lesser degree, and Gorsuch, any of these guys being above the law? Was that the founders' intent? Was that, subsequent congressional, Congress that want the Supreme Court? I mean, they're a sign for life. They have plenty of, power, prestige, money, this, that, and the other. They don't have to be corrupt. They choose to be corrupt because in the case of Clarence Thomas, he just wanted to keep up with the Joneses, man. And his wife, Ginny Thomas, worked for none other than the Koch brothers, and they were enticing the Thomases the whole time. Play with us. Same with Alito. I mean, these guys are all Confederates, and they're in the Supreme Court because Mitch McConnell, who may or may not be dead, ultimately outworked and outmaneuvered the Democrats and all of these. I mean, the Democrats are just terrible at war, and this is war. Okay, they're so malleable that they can go where the wind is, and they work for their best interest, which makes them chameleons and makes them basically complicit scumbags. Okay, say what you will about, I don't know. I like Ossoff. I really like Ossoff, but I can assure you, and I really like Raskin, and I kind of like Raskin. I really like Ro Khanna, among others. Those really come to mind. Sheldon Whitehouse, but they don't have a comprehensive way to destroy corruption, and they're all talking about we have to have ethics control of the Supreme Court. We got to have reform, this, and the other. We got to purge the Supreme Court, okay? And I'll get to that in a moment. But that's one of the four questions. Why should the Supreme Court justices be above the law when they're betraying the law and the Constitution? Are you kidding me? Let me remind you again. Donald Trump has pulled in over $2 billion in his first year. We have the emoluments clause. There are plenty of laws to be able to hold this guy accountable. but he's just running roughshod. And he's actually in Turkey right now on the new 747 presented to us by UAE or Qatar. I get those mixed up on occasion because we sold them all sorts of AI data, by the way. Now, what is presidential immunity and the unitary executive? That's a king. That's why we had the No Kings rallies across the country, this, that, and the other. And he's above the law and impunity and this and that. It's the most god awful betrayal of the Constitution in the history of, I think, anybody's imagination. But at the same time, it's like, who's stopping him? Here's a guy, Donald Trump, who's the biggest criminal pig, that is a pedo protection scumbag that we all can see clearly, that is in complete control. So the question, again, to reemphasize my point, who is stupid? It's all of you chasing windmills, all of you buying lies, all of you lying in service to something that's not the clean New Deal. It has never been more clear ever. Everything that I'm laying out right now, it's so crystal clear. It's like it's smacking you in the face or shoving, like I like to say, a giant shit sandwich down your throat like waterboarding torture. That's what this is. And look at all of these assholes looking on, right? What a great depiction of what's going on. But how did all of this happen? Well, a lot of it happens because of the Electoral College. So when you understand the perversions of power and you ask the right question, well, how can you put it all together to where you have a Shazam, eureka in your mind, like finally putting the Rubik's Cube together to where all the sides fit and you have clarity to where this system can't piss on your head telling you it's rain any longer, to where you can join a revolution of truth to destroy the tyranny of lies? Well, this. So the question is, the 10 precepts, there's one missing here, but I'll just add them all up for you real quick. The first precept is follow the money. I've been telling you from the very beginning of this truth bomb that we provided tens of trillions of dollars illegally to a criminal financial system that basically created the mafiocracy, or is the mafiocracy, that did it illegally to create the system that we're in the midst of. But how? Because nobody knows how the system works. Nobody understands that Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. Nobody understands that Congress is supposed to mandate the Federal Reserve. Nobody understands that the Federal Reserve had independence so that the Federal Reserve could backdoor tens of trillions of dollars through liquidity that created all sorts of ABCs of different rates and adjustments, this, that, and the other, that basically would also enable quantitative easing to the tune of $16 trillion to take all of the toxic assets that this financial system created and put it on the books of the banks until it would regain value. That was the trick that they did. And all of it was illegal based on what I just told you in Federal Reserve Act 13.3. So what we have to do is we got to create a new Glass-Steagall Act that, of course, once again, separates commercial banking from investment banking. We've got to align interests such that you can't pervert the system anymore by selling lies and liars' loans to millions of people who don't know any better and let those villains get tens of trillions of dollars in the process. And everybody needs to know it. We got to shout this from the top of the rafters for the next, 4 months to where it starts to take over the cacophony of the United States. Like, now I get it. We gave the Epstein class tens of trillions of dollars illegally for free, I might add, so that they could buy the government and basically protect their protection racket. And oh yeah, their pedo racket, right? I mean, come on, people. That's exactly what we're in the midst of. To do what? To be able to give a trillionaire, and I didn't get this point out earlier, for Elon Musk to come in with Doge that ended up killing 600,000 plus children around the world, while this guy becomes the world's largest welfare queen. How does that sit with you? It should piss you off to high heaven. It certainly does me. And if you're on that side and you're thinking to yourself, well, Patrick, this makes so much sense, but why isn't anybody talking about it? They get paid not to. Okay, and I'm talking about the good guys because they made the Faustian bargain. I'm talking about, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and everybody who was in on Dodd-Frank, who's like, we got to protect everybody. We got to protect the working class. We got to protect retirees. We got to protect the financial system because they didn't create the financial crisis. We're going to let this thing happen. We're going to just stay on the sidelines and we're not going to say anything when all of the CEOs of Wall Street that created all this stuff, got away with it. That's what created this situation that we're in. Let me ask you a question. If you have children, if your child is breaking the law over and over and again, and you don't hold that person accountable, how do you think things are going to turn out? But here's the second precept of the Clean New Deal that everybody's in agreement with, because this is the flip side of the coin. You got to end Citizens United. Dark money is just ask a victim of all the P. Diddy freak-offs if it's a great idea to have shadow scenarios happening. What happened with all the folks in the P. Diddy circus? They basically wanted access to power. They got roofied, then they got raped, then they got filmed, they got destroyed because nobody would stop it, because they were trying to get a piece themselves and they walked into a trap. Okay, that's effectively Citizens United. That's what's going on here. And that's what you're allowing if we don't end Citizens United. But again, if we give trillions of dollars to the bad guys who can then funnel that money into government to buy corrupt politicians, how's that going to work? So ask yourself, with the 33 candidates or races that are running in the Senate and the 435 that are running in the House of Representatives in all districts of America that include 30 progressives, ask yourself, how many are telling you this? I can count them on one hand, and they're only telling you one side of it. Okay. You got to put both sides of it together to be able to figure out things, because ultimately that leads us to the third precept. Once you understand that we've given over the course of the last 15 years, yeah, pretty much 2009, basically tens of trillions of dollars to this group. And these numbers, by the way, only go up to 2019. There's more that happened after. And I can assure you that both Trump and Biden were equally involved with the illegal use of Federal Reserve Act 13.3. I can tell you in 2023, maybe it was 2022, where we had a run in Silicon Valley Bank, and all things that affected all of the tech bros and everything else. Basically, they bailed out all things Palantir, Alex Karp, and for the life of me, I cannot think of, and I'm going to put myself on pause because I can't stand it. Because I gotta find out. I don't know why. Sometimes I get names messed up in my head. And I've been going a long time and I can't pause it. Why can't I pause it? Okay, I'm just gonna look it up while you're waiting, because I know you're all screaming at me if you've gone on this long. CEO Palantir. And he was, of course, one of the tech bros with, oh my God, Peter Thiel, of course. So Peter Thiel and Elon Musk were the tech bros that created the PayPal mafia, and that's all leading to central bank digital currency because of all things SpaceX, because of all things ICE and detention camps, and all things Palantir being up our ass, right? We bailed those clowns out. Think about that, all right? That's where the American, and that was during, of course, Biden, who were equally not going after Epstein or the Epstein files, and same with Kamala Harris, okay? So let's not forget that. But the bottom line is they got away with $71 trillion. So for those of you who are like, my God, we need a renewable energy paradigm to recreate the middle class. You're right. It will cost us about $4.7 trillion in their early aughts, according to Stanford, to reboot the entire energy infrastructure. Instead, we've gone backwards and backwards and backwards until what did we find out? The dirty energy fuels operation owns the Supreme Court. And of course, all things Donald Trump. What are the endless wars for oil? We're right back to where we started. And now we're trying to go back 100 years. People, if you want Medicare for all, if you want a renewable energy system, if you want to revive education, if you want to revive a country of, by, and for the people, stop asking where we're going to find the money. It's not about the money, because we are a sovereign currency who has, Congress has the power of the purse. You all know that we can fund endless wars. You all know that we can put billions in trillionaires' pockets. You all know that we can do whatever. You see it in front of your eyes. So why would you deny what I'm telling you? You need to know that's a starting point. And if people aren't saying that on the campaign trail, they're not speaking truth to the power. And that's what I found with candidates that are running for the midterms. They're not comfortable saying it because they don't understand it and nobody else is saying it, because it's such a remarkably huge situation. For those of you who have seen this whole Epstein scenario go down, 1,200 to 1,600 victims that have been buried for literally 4 administrations to do what exactly? Allow these guys to be above the law, raping children, right? And then there's so much more to it. Now, multiply that by however many tens of millions of people that got set up in the 2008 great financial crisis that then led to a global calamity that destroyed countries and companies and this, that, and the other, that this system had to bail itself out to give some breathing room and oxygen to those that had nothing to do with it. That's really what it comes down to. That's the world we're living in. So I'm just saying, when you are aware of how systems work, can you then say, well, listen, I'm not going to sit down at this card game when I know you've got a stacked deck. I'm literally giving you the royal flush. That's what this is. Because again, when you have the truth, you're bulletproof. Okay. Now, going forward, we've got to expand SCOTUS to 13 justices. We got to end qualified immunity. We got to end presidential immunity. We got to end the electoral college. We've got to institute term limits for senators and representatives. And we got to prohibit all insider trading. And I don't think I missed anything there except for judicial immunity. Yeah, got to add that in there. So I am going to finish up with this. Okay. Thank you so much for your patience and tuning in. This has been a long truth bomb, but we're in a situation that we all have to have absolute clarity. Okay, who am I again? My name is Patrick Lovell. I'm the producer with the $71 trillion truth. What is my credibility? I can show it to you all. And also I work with the highest whistleblowers in the country. They've had to quash me. I'm developing stuff with the New York Times. I'm really deep inside with Academy Award winners, working with stuff on the AI stuff. I do a lot of things, but I have the full story. What did I study? I studied political science and journalism. I've been in the game a long time. I'm 57 years old. I've been around the block. I know how this system works. I don't want endless wars for oil. I want to create a new renewable energy revolution that recreates the middle class, but at the same time, by purging the corruption and the tyranny of lies, to recreate the system to, when you, me, and everyone you see who believes in dignity and decency and integrity and opportunity and equality and beauty and sustainability, when we merge in unity behind the Clean New Deal, it is our destiny to purge the misery of tyranny, to unleash the renaissance of possibility. But if, and only if, you become a nuclear reaction vector to the big bang of truth that I'm dropping, because I swear to you, nobody has a plan concurrent to the corruption that we're in the midst of, except for this behind me. And that's why my name's on the marquee. And by the way, in coming days, I'm going to be doing truth bombs and interviews with people that are going to give us even more inside information about the latest stages of revelation of manipulation within the financial system that basically controls the world. I shit you not. It's all a manifestation of everything that I'm telling you. And for those of you who know anything about the Federal Reserve, I want you to understand that this new Federal Reserve Chairman, Kevin Warsh, he came out of the great financial crisis. There's a reason he's there. That reason, as far as I'm concerned, is to make sure all of those people in the shadow sector, as well as private credit, that are funding all things crypto, all things AI, all things the bubbles, and all of these different scenarios that have manifested what we call the big seven. What are they called? The magical seven, right? It's just basically technology companies. Underneath the thing that controls it all, really, or at least makes it all work, is the fossil fuel paradigm. And you can see how well that's working out. Listen, guys, I'm telling you, the law is dead. Democracy is dead. We're literally on the edge of the precipice of the world engulfing us from disasters on the reefs. The energy problem. Just the climate change paradigm is enormous. And we have been kicking the can down the road for now 14 years. Obama tried to do a lot and he got quashed by the Supreme Court. Okay. Same with governments around the world. We've just reverted backwards. I just want you to think of somebody who's an alcoholic or somebody who's a drug addict who tries to, get out of the problem that they're in and then they relapse. That's what's been going on here. Those of us who aren't that, who actually work for a living, who know how systems work, who want the future of the world to be better for our grandchildren, who don't want the system of the Epstein class to get away with being above the law, raping children and destroying the world, you have to grab on to this life raft of truth. This is a revolution of truth against this monstrosity of lies, because it is Armageddon and the greatest, I think, universal truth about all of these corollaries, right? Whether or not you believe in the Bible, which says the first words are "let there be light," or science and the Big Bang, it's the same correlation. But what we know through science is it requires for the Big Bang and just how stars operate and the lifespan of a star is energy, heat, manifestation, growth, till it gets so powerful that it explodes and it forces light into the depravity of darkness in this analogy. I hope I made the case because your life, my life, and all of our lives depend on it. I'm not exaggerating. And it's so crystal clear now. It's never been more clear in the history of our lives. And I swear, I felt it plugged into the red rocks, looking up at the stars. This is the greatest opportunity in the history of our lives, if and only if we, the people, determine it. It's up to us. No one else is coming to the rescue. It's going to be you getting this out there to everyone so that millions of people can start coming together under the umbrella of the Clean New Deal, so that people running for office run on the Clean New Deal, because we got to get rid of this insanity of corruption that creates the fascism that's going to destroy us all. Hey, man, look, there's a lot of writing on it. I hope you stuck through it to the end. Please let me know in the comments below if you did and what your thoughts are, and if you have any questions. I'm willing to engage anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances to discuss all of this stuff. But we got to get this to key people running for office. Otherwise, they're going to just tell us the same old bullshit. And quite frankly, everybody running for the Democratic side, mostly if they're not progressives, they're going to run on two things. A, we're not Trump. B, we got to cut ties with Israel. Neither one of those are going to beat the disentrenched interests. No, I promise you, the Clean New Deal is going to defeat it if you will it. Okay? Thanks for listening. All the best.